Okay, now we are at the shoe augers here. We're going to take a look underneath the feeder house here. And as you can see here, what we're looking at is our bevel gears, our backlash between the shaft gears and the shoe auger gears. With that, we're looking at the shaft bearings here, the outsides as well. What we're looking for here is about 20 thousandths of backlash play between this gear and the shoe auger gear. As you can see, we've got quite the variation here. Typically what happens is this key that sits inside this keyway will typically wear from the gear and the shoe auger just from the weight of the moving of the material. So what we want to do is we'll end up taking this clamp off and sliding the gear back to take a look at the shaft and the key itself. In my experience, I have found a lot of times when we get this kind of backlash that the shaft is damaged as well. Unfortunately, that's going to mean we're replacing the shaft on this machine. With that, we want to take a look at the shoe auger gears. Behind the gear, we have this bearing. It's very important to make sure that these gears and these bearings are in good condition. As you can see here, we have a lot of play here and the bearing is actually out. What that is going to cause is an inability to move that threshed material back into the cleaning shoe. As we continue to have these bearings go out, we would have the inability to drive the gears and the augers themselves, which will cause piling inside of the housing. That is detrimental to this machine in regards to cleaning and threshing. With that, just a short note, as you can see here, we've got the sensor on this far left-hand side. What I would typically like to see is a lot of this debris out of the way. That way we're not creating the heat between the magnetic sensor and the washer here, ensuring that we're getting an accurate reading on the sensor. Now we're on the back side here of the shoe augers. What we're looking at here on this side is the flighting itself. We are ensuring that we are not getting a sharp edging on these augers. Why that is important is because when we start getting a sharp edge on these augers, it's going to start cutting into grain, causing damage to the grain itself. With that, what we want to take a look at is the trough itself. We want to ensure that our troughs are in good condition. We don't have a lot of wear on the troughs, causing the inability to transfer that crop and material back here to the cleaning shoe. With that as well, just as important as the front bearings are, we want to take a look at these back bearings as well and ensuring that the rear of the augers are in good condition.
Moving on, we're going to look back here into the Chaffer area. What we're looking for here is just want to check for your louvers on your Chaffer. Biggest thing on those is to make sure you haven't had stuff come back from the chopper and damage them, which what we'll be looking for is the vanes or your louvers being bent forward or smashed down, or if the machine's got some age to it, you're looking for the louvers that are missing or broke out from the nails on the end of them breaking off where they go through the rail. When you get the Chaffer out, if you do have some broken off ones, what you want to look for is on the end of them where they stick outside the rail, is make sure that there's not a bunch of wear or they're not more than half wore off where the nails come through the side of the rail. Depending on what machine you got, you're going to have a couple different styles of your Chaffer adjustment. When you look at this one here, you're going to see a newer version where it's got the handle and you can pull down and it has your settings. The older ones are going to have just a flat piece of bar you're going to stick in to adjust your Chaffer and sieve. There's one all the way to the front that's kind of a reach. Them can be, like I say, they can be a challenge. For beans, that's going to be beans, wheat, you're going to have that one pretty much closed. Corn, you're going to open it up a little bit. Some guys mess with it and some don't. It just depends on the conditions and what you're running and if you're achieving what you're looking for as far as your grain tank sample and your quality. Moving on, we're going to look at our walker system. In this part, what we're wanting to look at is here's your walker bearings. The maintenance on these is 10 hours or more. More grease is not going to hurt these. It's just going to push out what it doesn't want. Once they get some age to them, inside these bearings are some cavities, and after time, them cavities will just be full of hard grease. So once you grease them, it's going to be lubed for a while, and then after a while, and it's just gonna push out the grease that you put in it. And so more frequent greasing is not gonna hurt these. What we're looking at on these is you wanna check for, if you grab a hold of the back of the walker, you can come up and down. This one does not have much movement on it. So as you can see, this does not have any movement. Once they get some age to them and some wear, if they haven't been greased, you'll be able to grab that walker and you're gonna get that to move up and down on that shaft. As far as greasing them, here, the grease dirt's right here on these back ones. Now there's a bearing exactly like this up on the very front of these, which you would look through the inspection hole on the side of the machine. To grease that bearing on the front, what you have is right here, there is a greaser and there's a hose down inside this that runs all the way down to the front, which greases your front bearings. You can pull this rubber flap back here and you can kind of look down in there and see and follow that hose, and the hose is usually zip tied up to the bottom of the walker, and just make sure it hasn't come loose and not hanging down, or make sure it's still there. And then once you get done greasing it, or as you're greasing it, you can usually look down in there and either hear or see the grease dripping, or just make sure you don't see where the hose is broke and just squirting grease down on something and it's not even getting down to the bearing. And on these bearings, if you get some that got some movement up and down on the shaft, what you want to do is, if you got excessive, you could take these 4 bolts out, and once you pull these 4 bolts off, the bearing will split in half. And usually where it rides on the crank, right in here, kind of in this area, on the top up here where it sits on the bearing, a lot of times you'll have a hole worn through it, or it'll just be really close. What we want to look for on the front walker crank is to drive your walkers behind these pulleys right here, there is a gearbox. And as you can see, there's a hose coming out right here, and there's a mark right here that says oil. What you're looking for there is make sure this hose is not old and broke. A lot of times after a while, with age, these hoses will become hard, and then with that gearbox moving back and forth a little bit as the machine's running, they'll break the hose. This hose will usually break off right up underneath on that gearbox where it connects to it, and then which will in return will result in a gearbox failure eventually. What you can do on these here is, if this hose breaks, you can take this hose off, remove the fitting out of the bottom of the gearbox, and with that fitting out of the gearbox, let the oil drain, and you can refill those with corn head grease. It takes 16 ounces of corn head grease to fill one of them. Make sure when you're filling that is you pump the grease in it slow, and make sure the breather is unplugged or unscrew the breather. Otherwise, when you're pumping that full of grease, there's a potential that it's going to blow the seals out of that gearbox.
Now we're at the rear of this combine here, and the residue management section, which is the chopper. What we're going to be looking at here, you guys, is the housing condition. We want to ensure we don't have any holes or any components missing on this underside. With anything as far as cracks, holes, and missing components, it allows that crop material to build up and start plugging up here on the chopper. With that, we need to take a look at the knife bank that sits here, ensuring that all the knives that are running inside there are not excessively worn on one side. Again, those can be flipped over and utilized again on the opposite end. With that, we want to check these hammers that are inside of here. Typically, the hammers will wear consistently throughout the chopper. What we don't want to see is the hammers coming down into a point. At that point, we do need to replace the hammers across the chopper. That is important specifically because when we start losing some of these hammers, it causes this chopper to become imbalanced. It starts to shake the whole machine, and you can't cause damage on this machine. Typically, once this chopper starts to get imbalanced, we'll start to see some cracking on this back tail board here. With that, typically when I'm replacing the hammers on a chopper, what I'm going to do is rotate the system around, so that way I can utilize these holes on the housing to blow that out. Bean stubble and other crop material is very, very likely to pack inside of that and cause that chopper to come in balance again. Just by being in certain positions, it could cause that chopper to walk around. With that, we're going to discuss this tailboard here. As you can see, we've got multiple vanes on this tailboard. We want to ensure that they are all in good working condition. As you can see, we are missing some of these vanes. They are adjustable, so we want to ensure that they are all in working condition. That way we can adjust these vanes so that the crop material broadcasts out and covers the width of the head. That we are getting good ground cover and allowing that crop material to deteriorate through the off season. Now we are here on the elevator section of this combine. As you can see, I'm standing next to the clean grain elevator. Things we want to be looking for on these machines is the paddle chain adjustment here, as well as the auger adjustments. Again, when you're adjusting this bearing for the paddle chain tension, you're also going to be adjusting the auger as well. Just something to keep in your mind in the back of your head is that clearance for the auger to the trough. Now, when we're adjusting this paddle chain bearing, what we want to be looking for here is the tension from the sprocket to the chain. We want to ensure that we do not have the ability to pull the chain away from the sprocket, but we can move it side to side. That creates that adequate tension on that paddle chain and keep it from flopping around inside the elevator. Now with that, what we want to do is to check and make sure that the key and the sprocket are in good condition as well in comparison to the auger shaft. With that, typically what I've seen in the past is a lot of auger damage due to the key getting worn to a certain extent prior to being replaced, and in turn we're going to be replacing the entire auger. With that, what we want to look at is the bearings not only on this side of the housing, but on the other end of the auger on the other side of the combine. Ensuring we don't have any toughness in there, that the bearing is free and greased. With that, we just want to be checking the elevator housing itself, ensuring we don't have any cracking or any holes in it as well, because as you can imagine, at this point, the grain is nice and clean, and we don't want to be losing it outside of the combine at this point in time. With that, one of the last checks we need to be looking at here is this boot on the clean grain elevator itself, ensuring that this is not worn or damaged or have a lot of crop material buildup. Again, that's going to restrict our flow and capability of keeping that grain in the machine. Now we're going to climb up here and go into the grain tank and discuss some issues and things to look for on the loading auger and the cross augers in the grain tank. As you can see, now we are in the grain tank. We're going to be discussing this loading auger as well as these cross augers that are beneath me. Starting off, things to look at here are the auger to the drive lugs down on the gear case, ensuring that we have good contact on there. Unfortunately, the only way to look at the drive lugs on the gear case is to remove this housing and auger completely. That gives us the ability to look at that drive lug and see what the wear looks like on those two drive lugs. That's important because with wear on those drive lugs, we're going to have the ability to not be driving this auger, so it's a good idea to take a look down there on the drive lugs. With that, tucked back inside of here is where your dipstick is going to be for that gear case. It's vital to ensure that that gear case is full of oil. That way we're not causing an issue internally on the gear case, again, allowing this not to drive. Now, as you can see, as we look over here to auger condition, you can see how the flighting is starting to ripple back, as well as the thinness of the auger. You can see here that they had installed a poly insert here to assist with the life of this auger. Again, that is a viable option for some of you guys that do have an auger that's starting to show a lot of signs of wear. With the auger, we want to be checking this top bearing, ensuring that it's not frozen up, that we don't have movement back and forth on the auger, allowing it to work itself out when crop flow comes into play. Again, with the loading auger, looking at this housing, you can see that some of the housing is missing. It's starting to peel back here. What happens is when the crop flow comes through here, it starts to wear on this housing and starts to wear that metal down. With that, the sample trough here, as you can see, is not being held on by very much. It's an obviously good idea to look at the housing condition as well as the trough when it comes to the in-season harvest. With any of these issues that I have discussed here, it's very vital to take a look at this system. simply because with any of these issues I have discussed, you can start causing a backup in this housing, where this is where the clean grain comes in and dumps off the crop into the loading auger system. What will happen is this crop flow will start to get backed up in here when this auger can't rotate, causing this elevator paddle chain to have damage and possibly break. That's not a scenario you want to get involved with. It's not a fun job to come out to these machines and have to dig this all out. So it's very vital to ensure that this loading auger system is functional and in good condition. Now, as I discussed beneath me is our cross augers. What we want to look for here, again, like many of these augers that we have on this machine, we want to ensure that the flighting is in good shape, at least 1/4 inch thick, that we're not worn down to a point, much like this loading auger. Again, these sharp augers will cause damage to the crop and are ineffective for our crop flow. With that, our auger covers and troughs, we want to ensure that they are in good working condition. It allows the augers that time frame to move that crop material out. So if we do not have these panels over top, we get a big issue here where we're overloading the unload system. With that, the troughs, we want to ensure that they are not worn through, rusted out, allowing the crop that ability to exit the grain tank. We've done all this work to this point to get this nice clean crop into the grain tank. The last thing we want to do is allow it to escape the grain tank. Much like the loading auger, there is that ability to add some inserts underneath these augers.
Okay, at this point, we're really close to having the grain in the tank and into the truck. So once we get to this point, what we're looking for is the unload auger system. We're going to start right here with the drive system. What we want to look for on this drive system is this pulley here to start out with. You can see this one here has some wear on the shaft and the drive hub. At this point, you would want to remove these pulleys and that drive hub. Most likely, you're going to end up replacing the driver and even possibly the shaft. Because what will happen is on that driver is your shear pin, and if that shear pin's got a lot of slop in it, what can possibly happen is during engagement, if there's enough slop in it and it jerks, it's going to shear that pin off, and then you're going to have to come back and roll it around, get the pin out, and replace the pin and hope it doesn't do it the next time. And then also up here is your cylinder, which is your engage. It actually pushes down onto this piece here, which pushes onto your belts to engage the belt. One thing to look at on that is to make sure that cylinder is not leaking oil. Otherwise, after so long, once it starts to leak, it'll leak, and then you ain't gonna hold enough tension on your belts, which is in return is gonna let your belt slip. So, as far as the belt quality, what you want to look for is if you come around up on the backside, right here you really can't see it, but up on the backside you can kind of grab a hold of the belts, roll them over, make sure your belts don't got no cracks in them or spots where they've slipped and got burn spots in them, or it's going to create a fatigue spot or potentially break. Moving on up here a little bit, we'll come up, like I say, your chain tension. On the chain tensioner, what you really want to look for is this one here is plenty loose. You can see up here on this tensioner, as I'm pulling down on it, it kind of kicks off to the side. What's happening there is this slot right here has a spot in it where it's come down and it's run there for a long time, and so it's got a wear spot in it. At that point, what you'd want to do, you can either replace this piece here, or you can also repair that slot by taking a wire welder and welding up and down it and then smoothing it back out and building the material back up so that it'll actually run up and down smooth again. Because what'll happen if you run it like this is it'll eventually get enough of a spot and it's going to come down and catch. And when it catches, it's going to tighten your chain rate up. The cylinder is going to keep pushing, and then it's just going to keep putting tension on that chain, which potentially is going to ruin the chain or wear the chain early, or in some cases will actually blow the bearings out of the back because it's pushing too much tension onto it. Moving up forward here a little farther, we're looking at this bottom gearbox. It's kind of the start of everything as far as the auger. What we want to look for on this gearbox is there's some bearings, there's some gears up in here and the bearings. As far as the gears, what we want to look at is make sure you don't have a bunch of wear on them, make sure they're not pointed, don't have a good groove into them where they're really noisy. If the gears look okay, take your pry bar and actually come up in here and you can get behind the gear and kind of pry back and forth a little bit from side to side. And if you got side to side movement, one of two things is going on. You either got a bearing that's failing, or you can also have a bearing that's wearing into the housing, which is allowing it to move back and forth, which is going to create your gear more wear on your gears. As far as up and down movement on that is normal, so don't worry about that. But like I say, just want to make sure and look at the side to side of it. And then as far as moving up a little farther in the gearbox, on top of this gearbox, there's an auger. As far as the auger, what you want to look on that is when we can come over here and we can look at, we have a couple examples here. What we're looking for here is this one here. You can see the flighting is really thin, and if you rub your hand down a little bit, it's not quite to the sharp point, but you're just looking to make sure it ain't super sharp. A lot of times they'll be bent down, or there'll actually be chunks missing out of the top of it where the grain has worn it off and it's thin enough and started breaking off. This one here is an example of a new one, and like I say, you can see the big difference between this one and this one here. Another thing you want to look at on this auger is your splines in the top of it here. There's splines here, and there's actually splines down here, which those splines down here are what this drops down onto your gearbox, which drives it. Usually them are okay, but up here is where we'll talk about some things a little farther on, but it actually drives your horizontal auger. When we were talking about the bearings being loose in the housing or the bearings being out, here's a good example of the bearings being loose in the housing. Right in here, there's a pretty good lip of where this bearing had got loose in the housing, and there's actually a lip in this housing where the bearing was moving back and forth in it. At that point, there is no fixing the housing, it's just a replace only. Some other things to look at while we're down here by the vertical auger, this lower gear case, is the quality of the bottom of your grain tank sump. What you want to look for there is back up in here where the troughs come over. You'll see a lot of times right up here by the support, they'll have some holes worn through them, or a lot of times on the sump, right up here on the front, there is a spot where that comes across and you'll have a hole worn through there, or it'll be rusted through right there. They do make some patch panels to put on these, and they also make some patch panels that if your cross augers in the bottom of your grain tank are worn, or they've worn through over here, what you'll find is right up in here, where that hole's at, you can actually buy a repair sheet to put inside the grain tank on the floor to weld and patch that hole up so you don't have a grain falling through out here by your sump. Moving on up towards the top of this, at the top of that auger, like we showed over there, there's an upper gearbox. The gearbox sets into the top of your vertical auger. That drives your horizontal auger. We want to look at the splines on those where that goes into the top of that auger. A lot of the times them splines will get sharp or worn to an edge. And at that point, if you get into some wet corn or something gets stuck in it, what'll happen is it'll strip the splines off, and then everything will stop turning. And then once it stops turning, things get plugged up, things come undone, and what'll happen is the timing will come out, and this auger and your horizontal auger will contact each other, and everything comes to a stop. When you're up top, checking your vertical auger gear case, you get that all good and everything looks good there. If you do have to replace something up there, as far as pulling that gearbox out, to get that gearbox out, you would have to pull the both pieces or the single piece of your horizontal auger out, go them up through an inspection cover on the side of the auger, and then you can pick that gearbox up out of there. When you get to that point, going back in with that gearbox, something you got to make sure and keep in mind is that this auger is timed with your horizontal auger. It's kind of hard to explain on the timing, but in your operator's manual and all your machines is a really good picture of the timing of those augers. So if you got your operator's manual, you can go to that section in the operator's manual for the unloading, and it's going to show you a really good picture on how to properly time that auger. Once we've got this section timed, if you have a two-piece auger, there is also where the two augers come together, that is also timed. Those pieces there just got to be, the start of the fighting has to be across from each other. And on that on the horizontal auger, when you get to that up in there, you'll have to, when you get it out, look through your inspection covers. You also want to look, just like we looked here where this auger is getting really thin, you'll also want to look through those inspection covers and make sure your horizontal auger is not getting thin, just like we showed down here. When you get to this point, you got the grain just about out, and if you got an auger that's really sharp like this, what's going to happen is it could potentially damage the crop before it gets to the truck. So it's good to keep, if your auger's getting thin, it's probably time to replace them, and that way you don't damage the crop before you get it to the truck.